Hello, welcome to COM 222 Intercultural Communications. Today we're going to be discussing African Americans and communication styles and where they come from. So, when we think of the term African American, we're thinking of people who've been in this country oftentimes for so many generations that they don't know when their primary ancestor came over. But indubitably, many of them were brought over as slaves. So African American communication is as complex as the culture from which it came. Taken from the shores of Africa, the enslaved captives created means of expression consistent with an African cultural tradition, but also included adaptation to their life in the New World. And keeping in mind that when one is a slave, the people who have enslaved you will oftentimes try to beat your language out of you, beat your culture out of you, beat your religion out of you. So a lot of the African American cultural aspects that we think of are a combination of what it was like coming from a particular country in Africa and what it was like to be enslaved and in an environment where their entire identity was trying to be squashed. The combination of past traditions with slavery and post-slavery experiences in the rural South and North created a unique ethnic culture for the group known as African Americans. So, this post-slavery experience, 1865, slaves are freed, was that the end of racism? Absolutely not. We had the sharecroppers where, families were given a plot of land and basically 90% of their profit was taken away from them by the people who owned the land. So there was all these institutional roadblocks that created inopportunity for African Americans. Even those who came north oftentimes were quote unquote ghettoized because, again, the thought was there's these interlopers coming in and trying to take our jobs, the same way they treated the Italians, the Irish, the Chinese, and every other culture that was discriminated against in the early years of the United States. Culture and ethnicity are the concepts that govern African American identity and ensure its survival. Communication is created, shared, and transmitted through communication. So the African American songs that came out of the slavery era, they were stories. They were meditations on their condition. And as these grew, so grew the culture of this combination American slave plus African origin. Ethnicity pertains to the traditions, heritage, and ancestry that define a people. It is particularly apparent in a group's expressive forms. So when we think of the ethnicity, we're thinking of their heritage, where they came from, their ancestry. But, ethnicity is so much more than just, if you came from Africa. Africa right now has 1 billion people and 30, 40 countries. From the north with Egypt all the way down to South Africa, Madagascar, and so on. So, we're again monolithing this entire continent, but really what we're doing is we're taking the people who were enslaved, brought to the United States and other countries, to basically be the backbone of the economy in the South especially, but whose culture was being denied, and they had to create a new culture. So that brings us to the question, are all black people in the U.S. African American? Many Americans of color have rejected the label African American because of a variety of reasons. Some Americans of color have come from the Caribbean or South America. So if you're Brazilian, you're a South American, you're not African. So there is this kind of disconnect in the stereotypes or assumptions that people who are not of color often make. Some Americans of color are immigrants who identify more closely with their home country's culture, such as being from Kenya or Botswana, rather than the oppressed African American experience. So rather than seeing themselves as African American, they might see themselves as Kenyan American, or Botswanian American, or Egyptian American. People who have immigrated from Africa in the last 50 or 60 years do not share the historical experience of slavery and institutional racism. Kofi Glover, a native of Ghana and a political science professor at the University of South Florida, has said, "Whether we like it or not, Africans and African Americans have two different and very distinct cultures." And again, culture is inherited and communicated through the years, through our generations, through our personal history. So let's talk about communication effectiveness. And how we define it is that it is productive and satisfying for both partners. Communication is appropriate if it follows the rules and expectations the partners have, and these expectations vary depending on the context or the relationship between the speakers. So an intimate relationship like a husband and wife or a mother and child is going to be very different than the relationship between a boss and his subordinate or her subordinate, or the relationship between a teacher and a student. The positive feelings the communications have when their expectations are met make up the satisfying part of the definition. So the expectation are met because the communication helped satisfy the relationship in a sense, or the communicators were able to function effectively in a new situation. Think about it. If you and your spouse are not getting along and you go to therapy, and the therapist is really there to help facilitate communication and not, allow just a screaming match to go on, people are going to feel better because they're being heard. And that's really what everybody wants, is they want to be heard, and they want to be acknowledged, and they want to be validated that their opinion is being listened to. Since different ethnic groups have different shared histories and ways of seeing the world, we believe that the unspoken, often subconscious rules that one co-culture has for effective or satisfying communication may differ from those of another. The race and power inequalities in the United States have led to African Americans and other American co-cultures applying differing rules for measuring effective communication with in-group and out-group members. So, again, when you are with a intimate group of people who have the same co-culture as you, or you're in the in-group, so for example, you are part of the Greek Orthodox community, and when you get together on the weekends to have a festival or a party, you're going to feel a much more satisfying communication experience than if you have to change the way your culture has taught you to communicate without group members. Intragroup communication issues. And this really comes down to how different co-cultures often communicate with one another. So, researchers asked African Americans, Mexican Americans, and European Americans to describe satisfying or dissatisfying conversations they had experienced with a member of their own ethnic group. Research studies indicated that Mexican Americans differed the most, with African Americans and European Americans responding more similarly. Mexican Americans, for example, tended to see closely bonded relationships, seeing the relationship itself as the rewarding experience. So the relationship is more important than the communication. Also, Mexican Americans found bonding conditional, established only if exchange of ideas took place. So for this particular culture, the idea of establishing a relationship, gaining intimate knowledge of each other's lives, that in and of itself is the satisfying part of communicating. African Americans, and to a greater extent European Americans, were self-oriented, meaning that they saw the reward in something the other partner might provide for them instead of the existence of the relationship. So, for example, you work at a company and you develop a relationship over the phone with one of your vendors. And you're thinking that this relationship is based on the idea that you're going to scratch his back and they're going to scratch your back. So in other words, when there's a good sale, they contact you first. When you need a little overnight delivery without it appearing on the books, you contact them. So, it's really a matter of networking as opposed to relationship building. In keeping with this idea of potential reward, European Americans tended to look more to the future of their relationship. At the same time, European Americans demonstrated less concern and interest for the partner in the communication or conversation. African Americans, on the other hand, found greater satisfaction in conversations where both partners were more involved in the topic. African Americans found satisfaction when they knew where the conversation was going. So again, it's that, background, it's that understanding. It's even when we just sit around and talk about stuff on TV or the movies, African Americans and European Americans and Mexican Americans have very different tastes in culture, but there are a few overlaps. For example, a movie like Black Panther appeals to everybody. It certainly appeals to the African American culture, but it also appeals to just about anyone who likes action movies, or comic book movies, or movies about a hero finding his way in the world. So there were 7 primary issues important to the African Americans studied. 1. Negative stereotyping. 2. Acceptance. 3. Personal expressiveness. 4. Authenticity. 5. Understanding. 6. Goal attainment. And 7. Power dynamics. So let's start with the first one. Negative stereotyping is the use of rigid racial categories that distort an African American's individuality. So over here on the right hand side, you have a woman on the top who says, "I am black, but I am not," and she has angry written on both forearms and her chest. And that is a stereotype that is very common, is the angry black woman who's going to lose her mind about stuff. But again, it's a stereotype. Are there some people like that? Sure. Is every black woman in the United States like that? Absolutely not. Explicit negative stereotyping occurs when European Americans treat African Americans as a member of a group. And that's that monolithic, everybody who is fill in the blank has this characteristic. Or ascribe to them characteristics of the group instead of treating them like individuals. Indirect stereotyping occurs when European Americans talk to African Americans about what are considered to be African American topics, such as sports or music. One research participant, a male African American, saw the introduction of such topics as an attempt to find common interests, but also saw them as patronizing or unaware. So, you're bringing up, oh, what do you think of LeBron moving to LA? And, sure, that's a valid conversation for somebody who may love basketball, but why aren't you bringing up, hey, did you see what the stock market is doing? Or are you interested in looking at real estate opportunities? Those kinds of conversations that are not exclusively based on someone's color of their skin. Another type of indirect stereotyping is when European Americans ask or expect an African American to speak on behalf of all African Americans. And again, what you see here is this idea that we have, we watch TV, we see the news, they bring on Reverend Al Sharpton or another African American talking head, as they're called in the news business, to discuss something that has happened to African Americans. And this is one perspective. The other day I watched Don Lemon interviewing a very conservative African American aide in the White House. And, there was a clear divide in how these two men saw America. So it's an interesting dynamic when you have expectations that a person can speak for the entire monolithic group. Now over here on the right, you'll notice the bottom picture is Oprah, who is awesome, as everybody knows. So if the stereotype of black women is poor, loud, and angry, and have lots of babies to get government money, where does she fit in? Where does Beyonce fit in? Where does any number of African American successful men and women fit into these stereotypes? Number 2, acceptance is the feeling that another accepts, confirms, and respects one's opinion. Frequently, African Americans did not feel accepted by European Americans. This acceptance might be shown by positive nonverbal behaviors, similar dress, feeling comfortable with the conversation, as well as mutual respect for each other's beliefs. And that's really what it comes down to, is just mutual respect. It's you may not want to eat a certain kind of African food, that's fine. But respect that it is something that they enjoy. And it's the same thing you should do with everyone. Number 3, personal expressiveness refers to the verbal and nonverbal expressions of thoughts, ideas, or feelings. Expressiveness varies from person to person. So, you go to talk to somebody, and if they are Italian, the stereotype is that they're very animated when they talk. They use their hands, and they're making facial expressions that are exaggerated, that kind of a thing. So expressiveness from that perspective is kind of expressiveness on the maximum scale. Whereas you go to England and their stereotype is that they keep everything inside and they maintain a stiff upper lip. And for those of you who have not heard that expression, it's a real expression and it means to keep everything inside. So you have somebody who is very unexpressive. So those are kind of, if you think of the barometer of where we're talking about. So some see honesty, integrity, and the open sharing of ideas as valuable. Others feel it is important to keep their feelings hidden, depending on their culture. Interestingly, more women than men express the need to portray a tough exterior. African American women have had to be strong both in response to prejudice and often as the head of household, which has been recognized to have occurred because of the drug wars of the 80s and 90s, where the Justice Department put a 3 strikes and you're out, meaning you go to jail for the rest of your life if you're caught with drugs 3 times, which threw a lot of African American men in prison because there was a focused decision by the government to bring down the African American community in many ways. CIA introduced crack into the urban areas. The Justice Department passed these laws. The privatized prison organizations put up more and more prisons for less and less money for the state staff to spend. And what it did was it took the strength out of the African American community, and it had to be picked up. And African American women were the ones, especially in the early to mid 90s, who had to step up and take over the community. Other African Americans prefer to be seen as nonchalant and not let European Americans know what they are thinking or feeling. So you see somebody on TV, for example, How to Get Away with Murder. Viola Davis's character, she can be incredibly expressive, but when she is having a conversation with someone that she's in a combative relationship with, she has that poker face that's seen as she is not intimidated. Also, a possible explanation for the contrasting answers is that some African Americans value toughness and coolness until barriers of fear and mistrust are broken down. Then it becomes important to express who one really is. And again, you're trying to fit into a white environment, so-called white environment, and you have to try to emulate what's considered dominant behavior expectations by this community. And when you finally are with someone that you can be yourself with, then that true person comes out. Authenticity is tied directly to the concept of being oneself or being genuine. Both African and European Americans perceive authenticity in a conversation when the other person reveals personal information, being honest or expressing personal feelings freely. Many African American males engage in self-presentation. They try to create an acceptable image of themselves through white dialectical speech and mainstream fashion, meaning they dress as if they had money even if they don't. These elements become the armor that African Americans use to protect themselves. Creating an acceptable self-image becomes critical when demeaning images have been imposed by European American society. In response to this, stylized behavior has emerged as a sign of strength, not lack of authenticity to African Americans. You go to a Catholic church any given Sunday, you got people in jeans, you have some people who are dressed nicely, some people appear in a suit, but the vast majority of people are sitting there very casual. You go to an African American church on the weekend, on a Sunday, and people really dress up. They look really good. And again, it's that sense of, I have been demeaned my entire life. And in this community, where I am not only seen as my authentic self, I can be the person who is above others in terms of the dress. I am, and not, others in the same culture, but, this idea that you should dress up when you do something important like commune with God. Number 5, understanding is the feeling that messages are successfully conveyed. This is expressed when people feel that information was adequately exchanged or learning took place. And oftentimes, and women can often relate to this, you're in a meeting and a suggestion is made by a woman or someone who is African American or Hispanic American, and people just kind of go, oh, okay, and then they keep talking, and a white guy, and I'm not beating up on white guys, that's the dominant society in the United States right now, basically says the same thing that the woman or the minority has said, and suddenly it's a great idea. So, the recognition of being heard and validated, getting back to that idea, is incredibly important for women and minorities. Number 6, goal attainment, or achieving desired ends from a conversation, was mentioned more in satisfying conversations than in dissatisfying ones. It is closely linked to understanding that without some mutual understanding, no goals will be met. So if you're in a relationship where all you do is scream at each other, you're not going anywhere. You can't achieve anything. So, take the personal and apply it to the professional. If you can't have some sort of mutual understanding, you're not going to move forward at your job. But cultural misunderstandings can get in the way of goals. blacks and whites may come from a very different meaning, may come away with a different meaning from a conversation because concepts aren't defined in the same way. Because of this, African Americans often find conversations with European Americans unrewarding. Number 7, power dynamics. The last category contains two main themes: powerlessness and assertiveness. We'll start with powerlessness. Is a feeling of being controlled, manipulated, or trapped, resulting in behaviors that rob African Americans of the right to express their ideas freely. African American women feel pressured into using chemical treatments on their hair to provide them a more mainstream look, while others use their natural hair as a political statement. So, again, it's how you perceive your actions that will either empower you or take the power away. Then assertiveness, extreme assertiveness and confrontation, often used by African Americans, is the other half of power dynamics. African Americans, it was commented, often talk with one another in a way that whites would consider antagonistic or brutal. So, in a sense, when we hear African Americans talking within themselves, they may be calling each other the N-word, they may be joking around, telling each other to F off, that kind of stuff. And you see that in the white community too, but hopefully not the N-word, but some other terrible word that we use to describe each other. And it becomes very awkward for the people who are not in that dynamic when they see people talk to each other like this. But that is, what we call code switching. And this is where you change your communication style and language when they interact with European Americans. We all code switch. The way we talk to our friends is not, or probably is not, the way you talk to your grandmother. The way we talk to our boss is not going to be the same as we talk to our friends. There is this idea of code switching that has become very important in the African American community. Now, the two pictures I have over here on the right-hand side, the top one is the movie poster for the phenomenal movie Get Out. And, when we talk about powerlessness, that is really, captured so, brutally and fabulously in the communications and the way that the action plays out in this movie. Additionally, when we talk about the idea of assertiveness, Michelle Obama, who was quite successful in her own right before she became the First Lady, or FLOTUS, as they like to say, had been, some terrible things were said about her. They portrayed her as the angry black woman. They called her an ape. There's been so many terrible things said about this woman, and the fact that she can remain above the fray, so to speak, is testament to her ability to communicate effectively and not take on idiots and trolls who think it's funny to be like that. So, communication improvement strategies. And these are some of the things that communicators can do to help make interaction more satisfying. Asserting one's point of view, being open and friendly, interaction management, inform and educate, confrontation, treat others as individuals, positive self-presentation, avoidance, other orientation, express genuineness, internal management, and language management. So, we'll briefly go over each of these so you kind of get an idea of what we're actually saying. First, asserting one's point of view is to act boldly or forcefully, especially in defending one's rights or stating an opinion. Individuals use such expressions as stress, assert, and emphasize my point. So, it's not about just screaming at someone that they called you a terrible name. It's about making them understand that you are just as valid a human as they are. Then we have positive self-presentation, which includes two methods. The first attempt is to reverse the other person's impressions of you or your race. The other method is the deliberate desire to try and impress others by your authentic self. And really, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can come from the most poverty-stricken environment. So, Oprah Winfrey, to get back to, Saint Oprah. Oprah Winfrey came from an environment where she was poor, she was raped, she was pregnant, she had to get, I think she had to have an abortion or give up the child. I don't remember which one. But, here's a woman who never gave up on her identity as a black woman, but more importantly, gave other people the opportunity to see black women in the most positive light. In the same way that somebody like Salma Hayek presents this very positive Mexican American image. Somebody like Nicole Kidman presents a very positive presentation of who she is as an Australian, and so on and so forth. Be open and friendly. This strategy, used most often to improve dissatisfying conversations, is similar to positive self-presentation, but without the deliberate desire to impress. Now, I just want to take a moment and say this is not for African Americans to do necessarily. This is for non-African Americans, non-black people. We need to be better when we communicate with minority groups. And part of that is, to present yourself and to let people know who you are, and that you are not some, evil white racist, but that, you are interested and you are curious about their culture, anybody's culture. Inform and educate when information is shared to educate or inform the conversational partner, in contrast to asserting one's point of view. So, you have to learn from other people as well. If you are from Nigeria and you are having a conversation with someone who is quote unquote African American, from the historical slave ancestry, you need to educate and discuss what the experience was like, and not just say, I don't know anything about you. We may be the same color, but we're not the same culture. It is the same thing as if you think of someone who came from France and someone who came from England. They're literally 100 miles apart, not even 20 miles by the Channel, and two different cultures you've never seen in your life. So, not all white people are the same and not all black people are the same. So here are some quotes, because I love these quotes. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And that's from Alice Walker, and she wrote the incredibly important novel The Color Purple, which, by the way, Oprah was in. And then below that, Dr. Martin Luther King is not a black hero, he is an American hero. And that's from Morgan Freeman. And what that really says is, although Martin Luther King Jr. focused on civil rights for African Americans, he helped the entire arc of justice move forward, and understand that all civil rights movements in the United States since the 1960s have utilized many of the same techniques that Dr. King utilized when he led the civil rights movement. Avoidance in a dissatisfying conversation. A person might avoid either the conversation itself by leaving, or topics that are sensitive or demeaning. The first strategy is indicated by those who terminate the conversation or remove themselves from the conversation. The second is used when an African American perceives that some topics cannot be discussed with certain individuals, such as politics or religion. Possible methods of avoidance include not bringing up the subject or changing the subject. When you are having a conversation with someone who is dogmatic, meaning that they have certain beliefs that they are unwilling to examine, such as people who don't like Jews, people who don't like Muslims. They have all kinds of anecdotal evidence, but their evidence is not consistent over the entire group. So sometimes it's just better to walk away. There's no reason to have this conversation, and there's no reason to have a relationship with that person. And that's what it comes down to, is, if someone is so dogmatic that they are going to see you and demean you and subjugate you, there is no reason to try and convince them otherwise. They are unconvinced. They will never be convinced. Walk away, manage how you interact with people. And that can be done to reduce problems or just improve a conversation. Possible strategy within this category including managing immediate interaction, meaning you're taking turns, you're working towards a compromise. Postponing the problem, request a time to talk it over. Or finding different means of communication. Write a note. Sometimes the conversation can better be managed by just talking a little more or spending more time together. So there's a lot of strategies in how you manage the interaction. Postponing the problem may seem like you're delaying the conversation, but oftentimes it's better to let some time go by so both sides can cool down, or whomever is having the issue can cool down and talk in a more reasonable way. And their autonomic system, their fight or flight system, has also calmed down, so they're far less likely to get aggressive or belligerent. Other orientation means that there is a concern for or interest in the other person. This is a sign of satisfying relationships and might be created in different ways, involving the other person in the conversation or finding common ground. There is a thought process that if you want to make friends, ask people questions about themselves, because we love to talk about ourselves. It is the topic we know best. Express genuineness. This strategy addresses the issue of authenticity, of being yourself. Don't try to be somebody you're not and using big words that you don't even know what they mean. Rather, be who you are and be the best possible version of who you are. Confrontation implies either a direct confrontation of the issue or using questions to place the burden back on the other person. Strategies in this category include correcting misconceptions in a shrewd, effective manner, or by opposing the information, such as, "It sounds as if you are making generalizations that may not be applicable to me." So, sure, somebody could be saying something terrible about your cultural group. And if you know that they are trying to imply that you are part of that, that's where you can confront. And you don't have to be obnoxious about it. You just say, it sounds like you're making a gross generalization that's not applicable to me. So it's this idea, for example, that all gay men are effeminate. Well, there's a ton of gay men out there who ride motorcycles and build muscles and do all that stuff, and you would never know that they had any femininity within them because they were so overtly masculine. That's the point, is that not every stereotype or characteristic will apply to every person. Two more quotes. We have, "For I am my mother's daughter, and the drums of Africa still beat in my heart." This is Mary Bethan, and obviously she was the daughter of a slave, became a writer and teacher. This is so elemental to so many people who want to know where they came from. They know that their family was brought over, but who were they? Where did they come from? Then you have the probably one of the most famous athletes of the 20th century, Muhammad Ali. "It isn't the mountains ahead to climb that wear you down, it is the pebble in your shoe." So it's the little things. You know, it's the little things that chip away at your self-esteem or at anyone's self-esteem that take your identity away from you. And you have to hold on to both that mountain and also, get rid of those pebbles. That's where that, being genuine, confrontation really comes from. Treat others as individuals and equals. Leave race, color, or stereotypical beliefs entirely out of the conversation. Talk to each other without having the sense of color in the conversation. Treat people based on who they are and nothing else. Internal management. This focuses on how we think about or deal with a situation. Some of these suggestions include acceptance, objectivity, and non-defensiveness. I will control my actions. Or put the situation in a proper perspective, and sometimes it is better to lose a battle than to win the war. So, again, you're not going to always feel heard, but you have to manage that experience in a way that you will ultimately win in the long run. And finally, language management, which includes a few strategies that did not fit into other categories, including avoiding slang or jargon and use clear articulation. And again, depending on your cultural group, you're going to have very specific slang phrases that mean very specific things, whereas it doesn't always mean that to the general public. So avoiding those options. And this is for anyone, especially young people. If you walk into a company and you are asked to describe a presentation and you call it ratchet, I guarantee you half of the people will have no idea what you're thinking or saying, and the other half will think you're being inappropriate. So, last two quotes. Booker T. Washington, those who are happiest are those who do the most for others. And again, this other orientation, this other in terms of seeing everyone as equal, as individuals. And then finally, Michael Jordan, who I think he played basketball. No matter how good you are, always keep working on your game. And of course, what that says is, don't ever think you have achieved maximum ability. You haven't. Guaranteed. There's always ways to grow, and you just have to keep finding those ways. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please email or text your instructor. If you are not in our class, but would still like to ask a question or have a comment, please leave a comment below in the section. Thank you, and have a fabulous day.